of what we're expecting in terms of the implications of the forecast, primarily based on the SACO forecast, but then also with a little bit of addition in terms of what the latest global forecasts are saying, and tying it all in with the most recent forecast for the La Nina event that we're currently in. So as mentioned, this overview is generally expecting a positive outlook for the season, for the current season in most areas based on the rainfall forecast. Although in the northeast, we are noting that there are some strong forecasts for below normal rainfall. This is associated with the tendency for East Africa to be associated with below normal rains during La Nina event. So this is affecting some of the northeastern parts of the region, like parts of Tanzania, northeastern Mozambique, and so on. We're also currently seeing an early signs of a slow onset in a number of areas where we might have expected our rains to start by October. And so this is bringing some delays, as well as also affecting the pre-season preparations for farming. We also in terms of the implications, again, we are expecting that the increased wetness is likely to result in increased incidences of crop and livestock pests and diseases, which may somewhat dampen prospects of improved production. But as a colleague of mine has said often, rain means grain. So I think on the overall, we really expect that the rains are going to bring in higher production than negative impacts. We do have flooding potential. Of course, this is a seasonal thing, but more likely in the event of high rainfall or above normal rainfall forecast. So in low-lying areas, in flood-prone areas particularly, we're expecting flooding as a increased likelihood of flooding. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the risk of tropical storms and cyclones in member states in SADC, especially those bordering the Indian Ocean. So this is the SACO forecast. I'm sure you've seen it several times now, so I won't dwell too much on it. But just to note, in terms of or maybe I should dwell a little bit on it really, and mention that as I noted in the preamble, that we're expecting normal to above normal rains. That's what these cyan or light blue colors are showing for most parts of the region. But then in the yellow colors here indicating normal to below normal rains. This is kind of what we're expecting as I noted, in the northeastern areas. And Madagascar is also part of that, the impacts being seen from that in terms of the expectation for a reduced rainfall likelihood. And now, in terms of interpreting these the forecast, we do need to note that it's designed for a regional audience. The forecast is based on large zones. Just to give an example here, that each of these blue lines, these thin blue lines, is showing the extent of the zone. So we've got one zone, for example, which extends this whole area, and what we're saying is that we're forecasting the same rainfall outcome over this whole area. Same as well for DJF here. We've got this whole region here, which is expecting, or which we are constrained to forecast this, or to forecast the same outcome. But we do know that we do have local differences that occur. So that's going to affect the accuracy of the forecast. So this is why we say that it's designed for a large zone. And what we also note is that the transition zones, although they're shown as thin blue lines, but they are actually transition of climate impacts or outcomes occurs over quite a large area. So again, I'm going to go back to the example here, and we're seeing that we've got a thin blue line which is demarcating the difference between below normal rainfall or normal to below normal rainfall in northern Mozambique, Tanzania, northern Malawi, and so on. And then you've got normal to above normal rains. So what happens in reality is that although we represent it, or it's represented has quite a distinct boundary. But what happens is that this is a transition zone, and especially stretches over maybe a couple of 100 kilometers in some cases. So it's really a bit difficult to distinguish that, or to show this transition over a map of this nature. So that's why there's just this note that the transition does happen over large areas. Excuse me. Another issue to keep in mind as well is that the forecast does not account, I mean, it only accounts for seasonal totals, but we know that we've got dry spells that occur. We can have heavy rainfall events that can result in flooding, landslides, and so on. We also have tropical cyclones that occur from time to time, and all of these are not reflected in the seasonal forecast. So these are just things that we need to keep in mind as we're doing our planning, contingency planning, seasonal planning for the early warning, anticipatory plans for anticipatory action as well. That these are all things that can occur. And so one of the things that happens is that the national meteorological and hydrological services, they typically produce the rainfall forecasts, downscale the regional forecast we see here, and then they produce the national forecast. So I've compiled a few national forecasts that were available to me, and or that I managed to get from partners, especially in the national meteorological agencies. And what we're seeing, for example, is that if you remember from Zimbabwe, this was all blue on the regional forecast. Again, partly because of those large zones that are used at regional level, but coming down to the national level, we see quite a lot of distinctions. Same thing again with Zambia. They actually have made their forecast quite downscaled, almost to like location level, if you like, in this particular, or that's what the map is representing anyway. So just to mention that for those of you who are working with countries, you'd rather contact the National Meteorological Service and try and get their national forecast as well, so that you can input this into your decision making. Right. So now, in terms of the general cumulative rainfall impacts on agriculture, it's just a quick note here to mention. I think this is something that we probably have discussed before, that the first half of the season, typically we associate that with the onset of rains, basically above normal rains or normal rainfall in the October, November, December, or OND period is typically associated with a good onset, timely onset, which helps in the establishment of the crops. And typically when we have got below normal rains during this period as well, this tends to be associated with delayed onset of rains. And what happens is that when there are extensively delayed onset of rains, that can compromise the amount of time that the crop has to grow and might not be able to reach maturity. And also we tend to have a tendency of farmers reducing their planted area. So that's for the first half of the season. In the second half of the season, which is the JFM, that stands for January, February, and March, this tends to be associated with the critical period of flowering and ripening for most cereal crops. This is the time when the crops need water the most. And so when you get water deficits, soil water deficits during this area, you can tend to get the crop losing quite a significant amount of its yield, especially for cereals, because well, there's some phenological or crop growth processes that happen there that tend to either reduce or increase yield depending on the availability of water. So of course, if we tend to have an extended dryness during this period, similar to what happened last year. If you recall, last year we had forecast for normal to above normal rainfall again. It was another La Nina last year again, but we did have a long period of dryness, I think 30, 40 days or more, which affected southern Mozambique, much of Zimbabwe, southern Zambia, I think parts of southern Malawi as well. So we just have to watch out for this, that in spite of the forecast being above normal, I think we have to, as mentioned, keep in mind that we can have sub-seasonal events that can negatively impact our for our seasonal outcome. So this is a less likely scenario, but we as a scenario which has to be considered. If it's high impact, it probably has to be considered as well. But as I mentioned, it is less likely given the forecast for above normal rains that we have. We also have some. We also have to look at the past conditions in terms of how is our current soil moisture, our current vegetation conditions, and we note that I think one of the concerns we have this season. Okay, I'm just going to skip some of these slides just for the sake of time. But one of the concerns that we have this season is the issue of recurrent droughts. So in this slide, this is just showing the rains that fell last season, October 21 to March 22 as a percent of average. And we note that this below average rainfall, for example, in southern Mozambique, this is now the I think I can minimize this. Oh, sorry about that. I didn't realize that. Okay, so this area actually had, this is now the third out of four, actually 2 out of 3 rainfall seasons that were below average. This brown line is our average cumulative rainfall. Last season, 21-22, the green line was below average. 2020-21 was above average, but the year before that as well was below average, the light blue line there. So we've had 2 out of 3 seasons in this area being below average, having below average rainfall. Angola, southwestern Angola, we can see that this is the average line. And so 3 of the last 4 seasons have been below average in this area. And then come to southern Madagascar now, southwestern Madagascar. 6 out of the last 7 seasons have been below average in terms of the rainfall. So you can, I'm sure those of you who are in the field or even monitoring the situation from food security are aware of the impact that this is having on the ability of farmers, for example, to purchase inputs this year. Just the resilience is being eroded quite significantly. So these are some of the issues that are of concern for the particular season. So probably without assistance this season, some of the farmers may not be able to plant or to optimize their agricultural production. In terms of vegetation, we also see that there are quite a number of areas which had below average vegetation conditions, such as parts of Madagascar, southern Mozambique. This is an area that was impacted also by dryness last year, as well as Angola and parts of Zambia, northern Mozambique, and so on. And so for some of these areas, not all of them, but for some of them, pastures might be likely to be impacted. So going into the season, already have below average pasture conditions, and that might impact on livestock conditions, and also the ability for the pastures then to recover, especially in areas where we've seen like southern Madagascar, where we've had several seasons of below average conditions. All right. Okay, now in terms of the onset of rains, I did mention that we're seeing a bit of a slow onset to the rains so far. This map is showing when we typically expect the rains to start. So the blues, that's, well, let me start with purple actually, because in chronological order. So this is September. We expect the season to start in September on average in these areas. And then the blues, that's parts of Angola, southern DRC, and South Africa, Eswatini, and parts of Lesotho, as well as central Madagascar. We expect on average the season to start around October, and then the greens November, and the red or orange colors, oranges if you like, are December. So what we're seeing is that for much of the region actually, we expect the season to start by November or December. So the season is really kind of, we're entering into the month where much of the season is expected to start. But for those areas where this season is expected to have started by September. Try and keep in your mental picture these areas, Angola, South Africa, and then we come to this map here, which is now showing the rainfall anomaly. So this map is basically telling us how much rainfall have we received compared to average conditions. This is for October 1 to 20. And these brown colors are showing us below average. So that's why we're saying we're kind of seeing a slow start to the onset in some of these areas. We're hoping that, this will change over time. Some of I think the short-term forecasts are indicating an increase in rainfall expected in the next few weeks. So that will hopefully change the situation. And it's worth noting, of course, that this is still very early in the season. This map shows us that based on the current rainfall and scenarios for the remainder of the season up to April, can we expect rainfall to be above normal, or below normal in the reds? And what we're seeing is that for most of the areas, it's actually quite close to most areas having almost similar chances of any of the outcomes being possible. Okay, so to give you a short update now in terms of what we're getting, we know that maybe let me just start with this one here. So keep your eye on the right, the map on the right. This map is showing an analysis that was done by FuseNet, USAID, and the Climate Hazard Center, showing the typical areas which are affected by La Nina and how they're affected and the times that they're affected. And so what we know, I think probably most of you are already aware of this, but much of Southern Africa tends to get above average rainfall during La Nina events, which is what we have right now, whereas the East Africa tends to have below average rainfall during La Nina. So remember, I was noting earlier how kind of we have these large transition zones, and so this is typically what is happening here. Although we note that usually we, on average, as we noted, areas like northern Mozambique, we might say that they are not positively affected by La Nina in terms of rainfall, but sometimes also this the negative anomalies also creep in over that transition zone. So it is kind of an area of transition, but just note that our northeastern parts of the region of SADC tend to have below normal rainfall during La Nina, and above normal rainfall in much of the central parts. So what was this? The graph on the left now is showing us the probability of either La Nina or neutral conditions or El Nino conditions, which is shown in red, and probability of La Nina is in blue. So these are the three different phases that we can get out of what we call the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO for short. It can be La Nina, can be neutral, can be El Nino. And for this season, by DJF, which is December, January, February, which is when we will receive the bulk of our rains in most parts of the region, we have at least a 74 or so percent of La Nina conditions occurring. So we're expecting that La Nina is going to be one of the big drivers of rainfall this season. And this is actually also noted in terms of how closely the dynamical forecasts are comparing with our typical La Nina patterns. This map, the big map, the global map, is showing us what we typically get on a frequency basis. So out of all the La Ninas that we got between 1984 and 2012, what percentage of them were above average in green or below average in orange? And we see that this compares quite well with what we get from one of our dynamical models that we monitor in terms of forecast conditions. This is the latest, which was produced in October, showing us above average rainfall likelihood in southern areas and below average in the northern areas. Okay, I'm mindful of time. I think my time is almost done. So just have a few more to show you. In terms of, okay, so this is showing another update as well, showing the expected rainfall for November through April, this is done by a WMO initiative, which brings in quite a number of different forecast models. And again, it's showing us the same picture that we've already been seeing, so we don't have to spend much time on that. Okay, this is a bonus for those who were on the DRR call, but because of time, I won't go into it. I'll just mention the tropical cyclones. There have been some recent forecasts from the Southwest Indian Ocean Climate Outlook Forum, which is expecting normal to below normal number of cyclones this season. But we might have an increase later beyond January, but there's high uncertainty over how many cyclones we can expect. This is also another cyclone forecast that is done by one of the major forecasting centers, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecast, ECMWF. Again, because of time, I won't go into that. Okay, so this conclusion is basically what you read on the summary slide. I won't read through it, and I'll leave it there for you to digest. Yeah, that's all I had to share. Godfrey, thank you for this opportunity, and I'll be happy to take any questions if there is still time, according to the chair.
Thanks so much, Tamuka, for that informative presentation. I think we still have a couple of minutes which we can utilize to ask any questions and make any comments that we have. Colleagues online, I don't know, is there any, I see something that looks like there is something on the chat. Okay, please go ahead, Virginia.
Thank you. Thanks, Tamuka, for this presentation. I was looking at the tropical storm forecast as well, and I just wanted to see if you had the same interpretation that it looks like there will be some Durban flooding again this year.
Okay, yeah, it's hard to say. Durban flooding. If you recall, I think the Durban flooding was actually not caused by a tropical cyclone, if I recall correctly. So we have to keep that in mind. There are other weather systems that also cause flooding. But in terms of the tropical cyclones, so this is interesting. This is from the ECMWF, one of the major forecast centers. They are forecasting a larger than normal number of tropical storms to be affecting these areas. That's what these red lines are showing there. But that being said, it's also worth noting that, forecasting the actual trajectory of cyclones is an extremely difficult task, especially this far ahead into the season. So I think it's important to keep in mind this is the other forecast, the other way of looking at the forecast as well now on the map on the left that I'm showing here, which is showing that on average, we have around 8 forecasts, 8 tropical storms that affect this area here. But for this season, we're expecting a lower number according to this forecast. But the uncertainty is such that it might be this black line, it might be below or above the average number. And then we also have to look at this significant, this measure of significance, where they're saying that in some of these areas, like areas around Australia and in the Pacific Ocean, they've got more confidence. That's why they've kind of shaded this in. But in the area around in the Southwest Indian Ocean, which is our area, there's actually less confidence. So there's not, it's not as they couldn't get a significant, a good significance level for them to show with confidence which was the actual number of cyclones they might expect. So it's quite open. I think this is why they mentioned that there is high uncertainty. Yeah, so it might happen, it might not happen, but I think the possibility of it being there is worth taking the necessary contingency measures.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, I don't seem to see any hands raised by colleagues online. Tamuka, I have one quick question. I checked on the slides, the slide with the focus from national level focus, and I think I was particularly kind of surprised by Madagascar, unless I misread the colors. It does seem to look like October to November for the local focused. If green means good, it means that that they are likely to have good rains for that period. whereas on the regional forecast from SACCO, it's showing us that it's all there are increased chances of below average rains. So I wanted to just find out what's your take on that. That we lost him.
He's online.
Tamuka, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here now. Sorry, my I'd been kicked out of the meeting by my network decided to play tricks on me. But in essence, okay, I was mentioning that I should have put a legend there. The map for Madagascar is interesting. Let me just try and project it again there. Okay, so what the legend for Madagascar, this green is actually normal to below normal. And then the yellow color is below normal, according to their forecast. So that's the legend that they decided to use. Yes, apologies for not having included the legend there. But I don't know if that's what was surprising you. It looks like it's a good focus, right? Normal, but it's really actually with a bias towards below normal conditions.
Yeah, I think that clarifies my concern.
Okay.
All right, I don't seem to see another person online, and colleagues here present seem to be satisfied. So I guess that allows me to move on to our second, or rather third activity on the agenda, which is food security and agriculture updates. And for that, I'm going to first leave this opportunity to Imran, who is going to just give us an overview of the food security situation based on the FuseNet analysis. Over to you, Imran.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. Good morning, everyone. As Godfrey has mentioned, I'll just take you through an overview of the food security situation in the Southern African region. So basically what we are seeing is that there's an early reliance on market purchases across the region, and mostly that's signaling an earlier start to the season. And I think just like Tamuka mentioned, because of the slow onset of the rains, I mean, most labor activities are being impacted, and because of the high reliance on market purchases, this is actually impacting on household food access due to below average income. Also that across the region, you know, the prices of the major staple commodities are actually very high when you compare them to how they are usually. So they are mostly above average, and they are mostly higher than same time last year. And conflict continues to disrupt livelihood activities and drive displacement in Eastern DRC, as well as Cabo Delgado province of the southern Mozambique, where the IOM reports about 34,000, close to 34,000 people that are on the move between end of August and early October. Most of these, about 61%, indicating that they're moving because of fear of attacks. And of course, in some areas, the actual attacks taking place. But also across the region, there's some kind of worsening of the macroeconomic condition that is affecting households' access to staple market purchases, mostly because of currency depreciation, as well as the high inflation that is being experienced across the region. I won't dwell much on the forecast because Tamuka has already talked more on the forecast, where there is a positive outlook. Of there's a caveat for some areas, you know, that they may also increase chances of either dry spells or drought. So I won't go much on that one. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'll provide also a brief update on selected areas of concern, looking at a few countries like Madagascar, Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, as well as Malawi, looking at what are the current conditions in terms of food security and the projections moving forward. So I'll begin by looking at Madagascar. Next slide, please. So in terms of the market supplies across the country, of course, there's some kind of near average national market supplies for rice, cassava, and maize, owing to near average production from the previous season. But of course, in the Grand South of the country, because of consecutive years of drought, these market supplies are relatively lower than they usually are. And then there's also a typically high dependence on purchases, and in the southwestern areas, mainly because of no significant harvest that the area has realized from the previous production season. As we've seen from the maps that Tamuka shared, I think the southwestern parts of Madagascar has been experiencing below normal soil moisture for some time now. And given the fact that 6 out of the 7 past years were years of below average rainfall, that impact is actually felt more in those areas, such that there wasn't a meaningful harvest that was realized in the previous production season. And that there are also limited livelihood coping options. An assessment that was done, I think, towards the end of September in southern Madagascar, there are reports of high levels of coping, where households are actually skipping meals, sometimes just skipping 2 to 3 days out of a week without consuming even a single meal. More especially in the areas where HFA actually stopped in August. I need to mention that while HFA continues in some parts of the Grand South, there are areas where assistance stopped in August, and these are the areas that are experiencing high coping levels, where households are actually skipping meals, and some of them are actually moving to areas where the assistance is still going. So there's increased migration from areas where there's no assistance to areas where there's assistance. Like I mentioned, prices of major commodities continue to increase. We saw in August in Ampani market, where dried cassava prices increased by 8% month on month, and remained above last year's and 5-year average by 42% and 67% respectively. In terms of the livestock conditions and prices, there's poor livestock conditions because of inadequate availability of pasture in the Grand South, especially in the southwestern areas where soil moisture has been very low for some time now, and that is impacting on pasture availability as well as livestock conditions. But also because of the poor livestock conditions, there's decreasing terms of trade, where livestock prices are very low, but there are also increased prices of food commodities. So the terms of trade in this Grand South of Madagascar are actually decreasing. Next slide, please. So we kind of took a picture when we did an assessment in southern Madagascar. As you can see, when we talk about poor livestock conditions, you can actually see the cattle on the picture on the left side, and a picture of the goat on the right-hand side, where you can actually see that their body conditions are very poor, and this is why they are fetching below average prices that are also kind of worsening the terms of trade because of the consecutive years of drought, and because of that, over time, it's easier for livestock to get diseases because they are not feeding properly. So as such, also there has been reported decreases of livestock head sizes in the Grand South. One, because of the poor livestock conditions, but also because of overselling due to consecutive years of acute food insecurity in the Grand South. Next slide. Moving into the projected outcomes, what we're saying is, in the absence of humanitarian assistance for a greater part of the Grand South, we are expecting phase 4 outcomes in those areas, especially going into the peak of the lean season, where we're talking about reduced labor opportunities, but also depleted livelihood options because of the consecutive years of drought. And household access to food is more likely going to be deteriorating because of the progression of the lean season. Of course, with the beginning of the agriculture season, we expect labor opportunities to improve, but because of below average hiring power by bed-off households that usually engage very poor households in these labor opportunities, mostly emanating from loss of livestock, loss of main sources of income for the better households, bed-off households that are facing reduced hiring power. We expect that overall income from labor activities is going to be below normal, and this is what would mostly drive phase 4 outcomes in those areas because of the high prices, reduced labor opportunities, and households are expected to be really, engaging in very high coping strategies that are equivalent to emergency coping strategies. For example, reducing the size of meals eaten, migrating to areas where there's humanitarian food assistance, as well as skipping meals for some days of the week. Next slide. Moving into Mozambique, crisis outcomes persist mostly in the southern areas that experienced drought in the previous agricultural season, but also because of the conflict in the Cabo Delgado province, where there's continued sporadic attacks, where the insurgents are actually trying to recruit more people to join them. And then this is also limiting income generating opportunities for very poor and poor households. But because of the assistance that is going on in southern Mozambique, I think this is actually preventing worsening of the food security outcomes. Otherwise, if it was not for the HFA, I think we would have seen more worse outcomes than we are seeing now. So moving into the peak of the lean season, the projections are that there would be widespread crisis outcomes as more households deplete, or most of them have already depleted their own food stocks and highly dependent on purchases, but also that prices continue to increase, which would actually reduce poor households' purchasing power. But also the continued attacks that are happening in the Cabo Delgado province. I think this is also likely to impact on, households, preventing households from engaging in the coming agriculture season. And therefore, we expect that the situation is going to worsen. Next slide. Moving on to Zimbabwe. What we are seeing currently is that especially in the deficit producing areas and areas that were impacted more by the drought, most households depleted their own stocks and are actually relying on markets. And then staple grain supply on the markets across typical surplus and deficit producing areas continue to be atypically low due to below average production and government controls on free grain trade. And government has put up a series of economic measures that were introduced by the government and resulting in stabilization of parallel market foreign currency exchange rates, which usually is the main driver of spiking prices on the market. So we've seen some kind of stability, but despite this stability, prices of food commodities remain mostly significantly higher than average and higher than last year's. And because of the drought that was experienced, there are water shortages, for the drought-stricken areas. in terms of water for human consumption as well as for livestock. And in these areas also, we are seeing, you know, kind of worsening livestock conditions, especially in the south, the west, and extreme northern areas because of the drought that was experienced in these areas. Next slide. And because of you know, such conditions that we're experiencing now, the projection is that we would expect widespread phase 3 outcomes in typical deficit producing areas in the south, the east, the west, and the far north areas through the peak of the lean season in early 2023. And these areas, production is already depleted, and above average prices and below average income are what are limiting, you know, household access to food. So most typical livelihood strategies and income, including livestock sales, remittances, cross-border trade, are expected to remain below normal throughout the peak of the lean season. While you know, there are some improvements that are recorded in terms of remittances, but they remain you know, below average, as also because of the impact of, you know, COVID-19, where even in South Africa, the levels of employment are not yet back, you know, to the pre-COVID-19 pandemic levels. So while there are some improvements, the levels of remittances remain below average. But also poor households are expected to engage in consumption coping strategies, like I mentioned, such as reducing consumption and skipping meals. As such, you know, IPC phase 3 outcomes are expected to prevail in most typical deficit producing areas through the peak of the lean season until March 2023. Next slide, please. Moving on to Angola, I think because of also the drought in southwestern areas that was experienced in the previous production season, households are more reliant on purchases, and there's households are experiencing decreasing purchasing power, which is mostly driving IPC phase 3 outcomes. Poor agricultural and agro-pastoralist households in areas of Wheeler, Kunene, and Namib have reduced or no access to their own produced crops, largely because of you know, the drought that was experienced, where no meaningful production was actually realized in these areas. And that, you know, households are typically relied on market purchases, I mean, a typical area than normal. So from October up to the peak of the lean season and the end of the consumption period, we expect that food prices are expected to be significantly higher than average. And this is going to limit households' access to food, and households would tend more towards you know, accessing wild foods and depending on humanitarian food assistance. Income from labor and other livelihood strategies are expected to be below average and not sufficient to cover both food and non-food essentials throughout the peak of the lean season. As such, this is what is expected to drive phase 3 outcomes in these parts of Angola. Next slide, please. Moving on to Malawi. As the story has been the case for most of the other Southern African countries, there's increased proportion of poor households that have depleted on food stocks and are having to depend on market purchases. Food and non-food prices continue to increase, largely driven by macroeconomic conditions. We know that the government of Malawi implemented a currency devaluation, about 25% devaluation, somewhere around May. And this has actually impacted prices. And in August, maize prices were between 113 to 200% higher than August 2021, and 70 to 180% above the 5-year average. Recent inflation statistics indicate that in September, year-on-year inflation was around 25.9%. where food inflation was 33.7% and non-food inflation was around 18.3%. So because of this continued increase in inflation, household food access is actually being impacted, and increased number of households who are employing the most severe consumption-based coping strategies and crisis livelihood-based coping strategies, as indicated from round 27 of WFP's household food security monitoring. So there's an indication of increased number of people that are relying on more severe coping strategies. And as of September, only around 38% of the required funding for the appeal, the humanitarian food assistance that was put in place, is actually there, which means there's still food consumption gap. So moving into the projected period, next slide, please. Mostly very poor and poor households in southern parts of the country are already experiencing crisis, which is IPC Phase 3 food security outcomes, largely due to the impact of the tropical storms that were experienced in the previous production season. And households will likely increase the use of consumption and livelihood-based coping strategies, such as reducing the number of meals consumed per day, engaging in a typical labor migration, or selling household assets in order for them to access income that they can use to buy food. As such, because of the deterioration of purchasing power due to high price increases, lower incomes, we expect widespread worsening of different areas into Phase 3 across mostly the southern parts of the country and a few districts in the center and northern parts of the country. And what we're indicating here is that, though usually we don't include urban analysis, but I think there have been recent efforts in the country to do some kind of urban assessment, and where we've seen some kind of increased levels of acute food insecurity in the urban areas of the country. Next slide.
That's it.
I think that is it in terms of the update for the focus of areas of focus.
All right, thanks a lot, Imran. Okay, thank you so much, Imran, for that detailed presentation on the status of the food security situation in the region, including the projected. Because of our time, I'm just going to jump over to Ketu to just provide us an update on agriculture. And then for those who have questions, can we reserve them so that we then do the questions once the update on agriculture is completed? So over to you, Ketu.
Thank you, Godfrey, and good morning, everyone. I'll just be I'm very brief. So yeah, I'll be presenting just on the regional multi-stakeholder dialogue, which was looking on interventions on fertilizer access and markets in Southern Africa. So with the Ukraine and the Russia conflict, and obviously coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, farmers are having challenges of accessing fertilizer that is affordable. And in some countries already, they're experiencing a rise in the cost of fertilizer by over 150%. So, and as we know, smallholder farmers contribute to 70% of the food consumed in the sub-Saharan region. At the current state, the prices have increased, and vulnerable smallholder farmers cannot afford to purchase fertilizers, as stated, which has a negative impact on the production. And this, in the long term, medium, and short term, could have an effect on the levels of production. Next slide, please. So in response to this, FAO with various stakeholders organized a dialogue, which was aimed at deliberating in a range of mitigation options for ensuring fertilizer access for the vulnerable farmers. looking at emergency response in the short term, good practices and innovations, long-term interventions, and as well adopting recommendations from this meeting, which will ensure that we continue with sustainable production amongst smallholder farmers, which around this evolving scenario. In terms of in the meeting, what was observed is that in some governments have already readjusted input subsidy programs to help cushion the farmers. For example, in Eswatini, the government is contributing to 65% in subsidy, while the farmers are contributing to 35%. In some countries, like Malawi, we're already struggling to procure fertilizer due to the combining factors. And this was crucial so that we look at repurposing resources towards fertilizer procurement, distribution, implement concessions, and instruments such as tax exemptions on the imports of raw material, which can help upscale local production of fertilizer. However, in this meeting, we also we called at governments and obviously partners to help prioritize measures that could support smallholder farmers to access fertilizer. And in addition to that, also harmonizing rules that govern fertilizer production, trade, and the quality in the member states. Because one of the things that which was observed is that now with the shortage of fertilizer, there's a lot of how can I say, markets that are using fertilizer that is not actually good for the soil, that were now open to the market to supply to farmers, which in the long run is not good for production. And also in the meeting, we also looking at good agricultural practices such as conservation agriculture, and also things like biostimulants, which will increase organic fertility of the soil. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Okay. So in terms of FAO support to this is that FAO is contributing to awareness creation and galvanizing a collective voice in the region that we need to act now and on the foreseen risk of fertilizer for vulnerable farmers and households. And then FAO working with partners is currently implementing a program to support countries in Southern Africa to strengthen fertilizer regulation frameworks to ensure that quality product standards, control standards, and enforcement mechanisms are in place in the region. In short, that will be all. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Keto, for that presentation, which I think is very important as far as we think about the upcoming season. Obviously, we've seen a number of places where there are good prospects of good rains, but I think we can see some of the challenges that the region is likely to face, especially linked to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So as much as there are those high expectations, if the input supply side is not as great, we're likely to still kind of have some challenges. So I guess for those that are in programming, I think that information is very, very important. At this point in time, can I welcome questions and comments arising from the presentation that has been provided by Imran and also by Keto? Okay. All right. I'm told there are no questions on the chat box, which means that our colleagues online are okay, they are happy. But I seem to see a question from Keto. I'm not sure if
just to add that once the report of the fertilizer download is complete, we'll definitely share with the working group.
Okay, thank you very much. So colleagues, no need to be worried. We're going to get a full report on what she just presented. Okay, I see a question from something from Virginia.
Thanks, Keto, and thanks for the presentation on the fertilizer. I think it's quite an important topic right now. I'm curious where the data that you had saying that some countries are experiencing a price increase up to 150% comes from? Because we're having some difficulty finding good price data on fertilizers.
In terms of the meeting, Angela, if I'm not mistaken, there were presentations which they showed in terms of the change in prices. But if, like I say, once they verify the data and everything in that report, you don't have everything, and it will be shared to the meeting. But Angela can also add to that.
Sure, there was a study done by SADC and NAMEC and FNSWG in collaboration with FAO. We can also share the evidence that was gathered from.
Yeah, I guess given the importance of this issue, whenever we get this kind of information, I think it would be good for us to share so that those that are into programming can kind of see the gaps that a number of households are going to have in terms of access to these key commodities. Okay. There is a question. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. I wanted to find out within the frameworks of talking about these fertilizers, is there conversation also ongoing around alternatives aside from the traditional fertilizers and imports we're used to? I do appreciate the context now is quite an array of alternatives for the traditional fertilizers that we're used to. Is this also under discussion as we are talking about the regulatory frameworks? Thank you.
To Angela, you're on spotlight with this one.
Yes, definitely there was a lot of discussion around that at the dialogue, including, I think Keta has already highlighted on one of her bullet points that there was a lot of talk around conservation agriculture and the use of organic fertilizer in not only as an alternative to the chemical, but in combination with the chemical fertilizers and some fertilizer enhancers as well.
Yeah, biostimulants was one of interventions that could be introduced to farmers.
Okay, but I guess it's going to also kind of affect the area planted, or rather the area that is going to be kind of facilitated by those kind of supplies, I guess, which means that definitely we already have some concerns about the upcoming season. I think that's one key message that we can get from this discussion.
Definitely.
Okay, seeing no more questions from our colleagues online. Oh, there's one more question. Okay. Okay, can you please go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much. Just mine is on Malawi. Just a quick question in terms of there was this poor harvest within the season when also the rains were seen to have performed well. Is there an explanation around this? Possibly, maybe we can hear what exactly contributed to that.
Okay, Imrian, would you want to attempt that one?
Can you please come again on the question? I think I was not clear.
Yeah, the question was that I think in your presentation they indicated there was below average harvest for the 2021-2022. But if we, in terms of review of the season of the last year's 2021-2022, also rains, I think Malawi received in most areas normal to above normal rainfall. So I think I would just wanted to understand exactly what may have contributed to below average harvest. The rains already performed well.
So general, yeah, thanks. Generally, I think when you look at the national production, the estimates from the Ministry of Agriculture, I mean, the national production is around average. It's almost average, but I think it's mostly the variations across the regions, where the southern region is the one that was more impacted by the drier conditions and the cyclones. So production in the southern region was actually below average. But when you look at the aggregate picture, the global picture, the national production was just close to average. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's
All right. Okay.
that's good.
All right, thank you very much, Imran, for that response. And colleagues, there's somebody else? Shalina. Okay, Shalina, I see we have overlooked your response. Can you please present your question?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the presentations. Just one clarification on the fertilizers. I just wanted to check if there were any discussions around maybe how we can increase fertilizer production within the region, knowing that most of our farmers really are the suppliers of food within the region. Thank you.
Angela and Keto, would you want to try that one, or this is something that you may want to look into?
So what was the question?
I think if I got the question right, it was more like questioning prospects of regional production, fertilizers. I guess I'm just thinking about South Africa. It's one of those that do a lot of production. Of course, I think some of the commodities are actually imported. So,
Yes.
yeah. So I don't know how you.
I would like to take that question, or if Angela has can respond.
Okay. Yeah, I think we may want to do a bit of some research on this, but certainly I mean, from the previous discussions that we had, there's a lot of imports of the key components of on that production that comes from some of those, I mean, especially from Ukraine, and I guess that will affect regional production as much as we have capacity, but I think the fact that some of the inputs are actually imported from those the conflict areas, certainly that's going to affect the regional capacity to make any meaningful production. But I guess there's going to be more research on that. I see Tamuka, yeah, it looks this session generated quite a number of questions. Tamuka, if you can quickly give us your question.
Thank you very much, Godfrey, and thank you to Imran and Ketu for those excellent presentations. So my question, I think is more to do with monitoring in the upcoming season. Given that I think both of these two preceding presentations gave very good and detailed overview, but we're going to need that sort of information going forward. I wanted to ask, maybe it's not the right time to ask the question, but I'll put it out there, maybe it will come later. But anyway, the question is, are there mechanisms that we can use or implement which would allow the flow of such information both to the FNSWG, but also to the SADC Secretariat, because I think as the mandated body, which is kind of trying to maintain a regional overview of all the events that are ongoing, it would be good for us to support them. So that's my question really, in terms of just maybe a discussion among the members. What mechanisms can we put in place to ensure that we'll have good information flow of how things like the fertilizer and even the the production situation is evolving over the season? Over.
Okay. Probably on behalf of the working group, I suggest we kind of develop some dashboards that we can, maybe a monthly dashboard where we can document any information that may be coming from countries. I know, as a combined force, we are stronger. We have different ways of getting information from the member countries. And then if we have that dashboard, pretty much is what has happened in past similar kind of disasters. I know during the El Nino period, there was so much effort to try and make sure that information is shared quite regularly. So if you can agree to come up with a dashboard where that information, whenever that information is collected, it can be documented and probably shared on monthly basis with the FNSWG membership and also and SADC. I know there are also part of the system. So I don't know if there are any other ideas, but I certainly think that we need a dashboard.
Just to mention as well, there is a space on the FNSWG website that just went live to actually give regular updates. So if partners can pass on information to Selam as soon as they get it in terms of hazards and risks, and also updates during the season of food security. She can also use the website to share that information regularly.
Thank you very much, Sipo. I think that's a much better platform, actually. I know some have been visiting that website regularly, and I know some are still in the process of doing that. Perhaps maybe if we can increase our activity on that website, I think that will certainly help us to also get that information. But otherwise, Tamuka, I completely relate with what you are saying. We need this information to go to everyone who is important, who needs to make decisions regarding what needs to be done. So thank you so much. And I guess on that note, allow us to move on, and I'm going to give this time to Marjorie for an update on nutrition. We are slightly behind on our time, but I'm certainly optimistic that we are going to catch up at some point in time. So Marjorie, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Just checking if you can hear me loud and clear.
Quite loud and clear, please go ahead.
All right. Thanks so much. So I will be presenting on behalf of UNICEF as well as WFP on the nutrition updates with a focus to updates from some of the countries that we have been able to reach out to. Next slide. So what we are actually seeing is continued nutrition insecurity across the region. And just to highlight, I think the same countries that have been highlighted under the food security updates are the ones that are of concern to us. So specifically Mozambique in the Cabo Delgado region. We still have also concerns of the southern part of Angola, as well as now Madagascar and Malawi and Zimbabwe. Now, within the projection period and specifically focusing on the current situation, and this is for nutrition situation, the projection is indicating still the deterioration of nutrition situation in Madagascar, highlighting of potential deterioration of 14 districts that have been highlighted to deteriorate further. For Angola, still of concern remains Kunene, Namibe, and Huila provinces that so far we are receiving almost 60% of the caseload for malnutrition. For the between January and end of September for severe acute malnutrition, we had reached just the previous slide slowly. We had reached around 200,000 children for severe acute malnutrition, and this is from 9 countries that we are getting to monitor. And currently, in terms of our concern, currently is mainly in terms of the funding coverage, because if you look at in terms of the reach, based on the caseload that we had provided, we are almost at 42%. But also, if you look at in terms of the overall scale of other complementary actions, including infant feeding, as well as vitamin A supplementation, the coverage really remains of concern. So moving out into the specific country updates, I will start with Angola. Next slide. So for Angola specifically, what we have seen is still in terms of the overall burden of for malnutrition and the number that we have been able to reach, we've had a slightly increase in the number of children that have been admitted, but though noting between the month of May to July, we had a slightly drop for severe acute malnutrition admission, and this is basically of stockouts that have been experiencing specifically in Huila province. Currently, there are a number of, we have put in a request, and hopefully with the supplies that will be coming in the month of November, they should be able to cover the gaps. Just to highlight the post-harvest food security and nutrition assessment, which is currently being supported for 13 municipalities, and of course, with support provided by WFP as well as UNICEF. This is to the government, and as part of it, we are anticipating that to have at least more clarity on the nutrition situation in the municipalities of concern. When it comes in terms of the screening, screening has been ongoing for all the priority provinces, and this also includes Luanda, where we are also, this has been a highlight of potential deterioration of situation. So this is within the township. So far, the team has been able to reach around half a million children who have been screened, and treatment has been ongoing. But there's just to note, in terms of the number of children that have been reached, are slightly less considered, considering the projected numbers as well. So far, it's 7,000 children admitted for treatment in 7 provinces, and of course, Whelan, Namibe, and Kunene having the highest admission rate. When it comes in terms of the supplies provision, so just to highlight, we have both procurement in process for RUTF as well as for RUSF. And RUSF, this is the ready-to-use supplementary feeding, is being supported by WFP. Over half of the consignment has already been received in country, part of it being utilized, and part of the consignment will be received to cater for the needs in the first quarter of the year. Moving on to Mozambique, I think clearly indicated Cabo Delgado remains of high risk. So far, when you look at in terms of for both the management of acute malnutrition, as well as looking at for both moderate and severe acute malnutrition, and looking at other priority indicators, we have only been able to reach 47% of the nutrition needs. And just to highlight, one of the key concerns specifically is the funding, which for both prevention actions as well as curative actions, we really remain highly underfunded. So currently, we are hoping to have a call to action to be able to get more support to accelerate the progress, and especially just enhance our own resource mobilization. So looking at in terms of the sum admissions, you can see it's around 33,000 that has been admitted for treatment. For moderate acute malnutrition, we've had around 44,000 children that have been admitted in the priority areas that are being supported. Again, screening is currently being ongoing as at the health facility level, as well as at the community level through the mobile brigades, as well as other outreach mechanisms. And just to highlight as well, one of the potential is also for WFP. They have really intensified also the prevention actions, which includes both management of moderate malnutrition, but also looking at other supplementary mechanisms for pregnant and lactating mothers, and including support to people who are living with HIV. So just to indicate, for the blanket supplementary feeding programming, currently is ongoing in 7 districts. And so far, they have been able to reach around 140,000 children with supplementary food between January and September 2022. Next slide. So just to highlight, for Malawi, it still remains of concern, basically because of also access to the limited access to the production, but also of recent we have been seeing an increase on the health emergencies. So specifically cholera cases, we've had also in terms of the highlights of the polio as well. So of course this still remains of a highlight for nutrition, and we are seeing actually for the areas that have been affected an increase in the number of children that are requiring treatment. So far still, while, just based on the that data has been received so far, we had a 24% increase in the number of children who had been admitted for severe acute malnutrition, and this is just compared to the same period in 2022. But goodness to say, at least in terms of the overall performance, remains very high and within the sphere standards. Now looking at Zimbabwe specifically, yes, we know nutrition surveillance has been scaled up 35 in 35 districts, and just yesterday we had some preliminary results from the SMART survey that was conducted in the 7 districts. We have actually we have significant deterioration in the nutrition situation, though it's not as high as above the alert phase. But currently we are looking at a shift from around 2.6 to around 7.3% of the GAM prevalence. Results will be shared possibly officially at the end of the week. But this is a concern for us because for Zimbabwe specifically, we haven't been seeing, prevalence rates of around 5%. And basically, this is being attributed to multiple factors, including the food security situation, the increasing, cost of living in the country, but also in terms of the limited access to other, to the limited access to incomes, but also in terms of also access to nutritious diets as well. When it comes to admissions, again, potentially what we are seeing for 2022, still not so much high admission rates compared to other previous years, but then noting that the situation is deteriorating currently, there is a projection that we might be seeing an increase in the number of children that are being admitted into programs starting from this quarter and moving into the quarter 1 of 2023. The next slide is just look at in terms of the planning needs and the projection. Oh, sorry, before I get to that, probably just one word to say about Namibia and DRC. For Namibia specifically, what we are seeing is a slight increase in the number of children that are still being admitted, and specifically for the month of August, they saw a lot of increase. But for Namibia, when you look at in terms of for both prevention actions, they have supplies that are currently in the on the ground for to support in the acceleration of the actions. And currently also we are discussing in terms of enhancing the capacities of both the health workers as well as the nutrition leads on responding to emergency and looking at in terms of the quality of service delivery. Currently also we have just a team on the ground from the UNICEF side that are looking at how we can be able to scale up some of the prevention actions. For DRC, conflict still remains a measure of concern, but also looking at the food insecurity situation still remains of concern. Looking at in terms of WFP support, they have been able to reach almost 600,000 beneficiaries. This is for both for prevention action and specifically for management of acute malnutrition. Children in the stabilization center of last month, we had actually some of the highest increase in the stabilization centers, but I should be able to share with you the month-to-month admission trends in the next meeting. But one thing that we've noted that in terms of overall the coverage is slightly below, but of course it's what we are noting is in as much as is below what we had anticipated to target, but on the average, when you look at comparing it to 2020 and 2021, really significant increase in the admission, specifically in the Kivu region. The last slide is just to focus in terms of the priorities for 2023. And currently, almost all the countries are getting into the planning phase for 2023, looking at the anticipation of the needs, both in terms of the population need, as well as in terms of the resources that are required for 2023. And just to say, based on the projection currently across the countries, and specifically Angola, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe, we are actually, the countries are projecting an increase again in the needs for both the children that are requiring severe acute malnutrition, as well as the children that are requiring prevention services, including vitamin A supplementation, as well as support to IYCF. So essentially, because currently our funding needs were not met for 2022, we only had around 32% of the funding needs that were met across the priority countries. So we are hoping that we can be able to accelerate our call to action and resource mobilization, looking forward into implementation for 2023. Thanks so much, and over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Marjorie, for that update on nutrition. And colleagues, I'm just going to open up for any questions that we have on that before we move on to an update from Jones on prices and market updates. On the chat, do we have anyone? From our colleagues online, I don't seem to see any question. Maybe we are still digesting, and for those here present, I see a lot of satisfaction with the presentation. There are no questions here. One more time for those who are online. I think, Marjorie, that seems to suggest you've done an exceptionally well presentation, and it looks there are no questions. So I'm going to switch over to Jones, who is going to provide an update on prices and markets. And I think that's the work of some joint work between WFP and FuseNet. Right, over to you, Jones.
Thank you, Godfrey. Can we move to the next slide, please? Good morning, colleagues. I would like to give you this markets and trade update. First, to show you this global context, which is affecting our region. We have these two charts, the top chart showing the main FAO food price index, which is continuing its downward movement, which is good news. The main index is down a percentage point from August to September, fueled largely by declines in the price of vegetable oils. There were moderate declines in the prices of meat, dairy, and sugar, but of concern, grains have started firming up. As you can also see in that top chart, the red graph is closing in on the 2021 levels, but remains 5.5% for September relative to the index level in the corresponding month in 2021. Regarding the cereal price index, I'm focusing now on the bottom chart. You have the cereal price index there in the middle, the yellow graph. Wheat prices are up as of September, 2.2%, mainly due to concerns over the uncertainty regarding the Black Sea Grain Initiative. As we have noted in the last 2-3 weeks, there's been some flare-up in attacks, even including attacks on some of the ports, and there's uncertainty whether this initiative will continue beyond November. It seems to be benefiting
both sides, but whether this will continue remains to be seen. It's very difficult to predict how this is going to happen. So if anyone among us has any inside track on what is happening, would be very appreciative for that to be shared. Part of the concern is also surrounding conditions in Argentina and the USA, which are not very conducive for supplies. For maize, global maize prices are quite stable. So that's partly good for our region. As you know, one of our main producers, South Africa, is closely linked to global markets. And when prices are stable in the world market, South African export prices are equally stable. But for rice, prices firmed up 2.2% from August to September, largely influenced by export policy changes from India. We know there is a ban on exports of broken rice. A number of our countries depend on broken rice imports. There is also export tax, 20% export tax on a number of varieties of rice that are exported out of India. The other concern is around poor prospects for production in Pakistan following severe floods. So the situation with rice is trending in a not so good situation. Vegetable oils price index has been down again. You can see on that left chart, the top graph continues its decline. I think for the last I would say 8 or so months, it's been declining. Our region is a net importer of vegetable oils. So when global prices are coming down, it's good news for our region. The lower prices are attributed to, good inventories in Asia and the availability of soy oil in Argentina, as well as increased export supplies of sunflower from the Black Sea region. So I want to move to the next slide to present the scenario regarding some of our main staples. This graph, I have two charts here. The top chart shows the maize grain trends in selected markets, including Lilongwe and Malawi. We had Malawi is one of the concerned areas, Antananarivo, Maputo, also Dar es Salaam, as well as Goma and Kinshasa. These are the markets that are depicted on this chart. So on the left axis, I'm showing the monthly price changes, and on the secondary y-axis, I'm showing the annual changes depicted by the orange dots. So from that chart, we can see the seasonal movements are happening for a number of markets. The upward movement in prices which we expect this time of the year, is being confirmed by markets. We have Harare and Dar es Salaam showing some bit of dissonance, which I think is largely self-correction in prices. Dar es Salaam in particular had very high prices in August, and there is a self-correction going forward to try to match the levels, price levels in other markets like Arusha. You'd see in that chart, the monthly movement in Arusha is positive. So most markets remain significantly above yesteryear levels. That is why you find inflation is high. If you look at Malawi, for example, even Arusha, prices for September 2022 are more than 100% above September 21 levels. So this is quite a concern. And it's not surprising then that we have these indications of poor access and high levels of malnutrition being recorded in some of these countries. Even South Africa, the September prices are more than 40% above last year prices. But this is more due to the weaker currency. The rand has lost ground. I'll talk more about that towards the end. And this is causing domestic prices to also rise. In terms of parity price levels across these markets, I'm showing that chart at the bottom. These are US dollar prices per kilo for maize in these markets. You would notice that there's a wide variation from 20 cents a kilo in Harare to over 90 cents a kilo in Kinshasa. So one would want to ask, why is this happening? Why isn't grain moving from surplus to deficit areas? And what we can note is, yes, there are some difficulties for traders to take advantage of spatial arbitrage opportunities, partly because of policies and also because of the difficulties in transportation. These markets are not necessarily integrated. But it does show prices in Malawi, Lilongwe there, and South Africa are among the lowest in the region in US dollar terms. The importance of some of these domestic policies, when you look at the price for Harare and Bulawayo, it's almost 100% difference between these two markets. Yet they are just within the same country. And Imran did mention that some of the restrictive policies for grain movement partly explain this divergence in parity prices. Next slide, please. This chart tries to show the performance of our domestic currencies. As you are aware, our currencies are weakening, and this is adding pressure in terms of imported inflation, given that we import oil, we import vegetable oils, we import wheat. If our currencies are weak, we are simply adding pressure to our inflation situation. So among some of these currencies, we have some strong performance. We have the Angolan Kwanza and the Zambian Kwacha. They are performing reasonably well. If you look at the last column and showing the percentage annual movement in prices, the Angolan Kwanza appreciated by more than 30% year on year, which is quite strong. We also have the Zambian Kwacha, which has appreciated more than 4%. The reason why the Angolan Kwanza has become relatively strong is simply the oil revenues. The oil prices are high, they are elevated, and production has been consistent in Angola. So export revenue has been growing, and that has allowed Angola to improve its exchange rate as well as afford some of the imported food they need into the country. However, we also have some weak currencies. According to this table, we have the Zimbabwean dollar, the Malawian kwacha, and the South African rand. Again, when you look at the last column, the rand has lost ground against the US dollar by 20%. The kwacha also lost on year terms 25%. But the Zimbabwean dollar has lost by 400% if you're looking at the parallel rate. So for Zimbabwe, we have both the parallel rate as well as the auction rate. And fortunately, in the last 2 months for Zimbabwe, the secondary rate has remained stable, near and around 700 Zim dollars per USD, but the auction rate has continued depreciating, narrowing that gap between the secondary and the auction rate. You can see the secondary rate is 700, the auction is 622. That gap is narrowing. Even the last 2 weeks, the gap seems to be narrowing. The secondary rate is flat, but the auction rate is edging closer to the secondary rate. So that has been one of the reasons why prices in Zimbabwe have been registering stability in terms of USD as well as the Zimbabwean dollar denominated prices. In some instances, the prices have actually fallen. Take the case of roller mill in a number of markets that FuseNet is monitoring. Next slide, please. This is my last slide talking about inflation. As I mentioned, prices are rising seasonally, amplified by the high global prices. Currencies have been depreciating, adding more pressure to the inflation levels. Given our scenario in Southern Africa, we are entering the lean season. So we expect staple food prices to continue rising. And with that, we anticipate that the inflation levels are yet to peak in the coming months. We are going to expect a lot more price pressures over the next 3-5 months before we get to the next harvest in April. This is about 6 months down the road. So prices are going to continue rising. So inflation levels are going to peak much later in 2023. Sorry, I was cut out by my network. So we are just seeing that inflation levels are approaching double digits for the majority of the countries. Madagascar, Lesotho, and Zambia, they are around 9% for the annual rate. And it's only Tanzania and South Africa which are much below the 10% target. But the rest are seeing and registering very high inflation levels, which are going to lead to spiraling food prices. So despite actions by the central governments to raise interest rates, the inflation levels are not tempering at all. We know for some of these countries, the informal markets are very huge. So even when interest rates are raised, they are not affected at all. So inflation tends to be immune and non-responsive to raising of interest rates. But just want to end on that note that yes, prices for maize and other staples are rising, and it provides a positive incentive for our farmers to consider increasing production in the upcoming season. The forecast, as we have heard from Tamuka, seems very good. The only dampening factor is fertilizer prices. As everyone has mentioned, there is a fertilizer crunch that we have to deal with globally, and prices are high year on year, and that could eat into some of the profit margins for farmers. Thank you, colleagues. Over to you, Godfrey.
Thanks, Jones, for that presentation. I guess in the best interest of our time, I'm just going to ask Angela to also move ahead with the presentation on data or in emergencies, monitoring findings, and then we'll ask questions for those two presentations at once.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. Without further ado, I'm going to present on data and emergencies findings in Zimbabwe. Just a brief background on data and emergencies, and I will rush through the background slides because I have introduced data and emergencies monitoring system before. So this was launched in June 2020 to better understand the impact of jobs on agri livelihoods and food crisis projects. And it is unique in that it's providing timely and granular data to inform decision making. Next slide, please. It has 3 pillars: DM monitoring, impact, and risk. And risk is expected to be launched in 2023. And products on these pillars include dashboards and a map gallery, story maps, etc. And these are all on the website, which I will share at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. On this slide of note is the schedule that shows you that we are currently undertaking the phase 2, which is ending in December 2022. And next slide, under this phase is where these monitoring findings that I'm going to present today, where they're coming from. So for Southern Africa, as you can see from the countries that we have the DM products, we have DM monitoring in Zimbabwe, and Mozambique, and set to include Malawi starting from 2023 and Madagascar, and DM impact and DRC as well, sorry. And then DM impact is in Malawi, Madagascar at present moment. Next slide, please. I will not dwell on what the slide is saying. It's basically also just reiterating on the background and what this information intends to provide to decision makers. Next slide, please. That is our cycle, our workflow. We start with basically the sample design and creation of the questionnaire. And then it's a semi-automated process. I think this is what is more important to note, where the data cleaning and aggregation and analysis and validation are done both automated and in person in the countries that we have the monitoring system. Next slide, please. So for round 5, which is the one that I'm presenting on, the data was collected in September, which is very timely, and it's showing you the current situation, and it's representative at provincial level, and over and above other methodological issues such as the household quotas. It was conducted by CATI, which is the computer-assisted telephone interviews. We do not yet have face-to-face interviews in the Southern African countries, but we are hoping to have them in the new year, 2023. And comparison was made with the previous round, despite that round having been conducted at a different period in the seasonal calendar. And the recall period differs, but for most questions, it was a 3-month recall, except for the food security indicators, which some have 30-day recall and some have 24 hours and 7-day recall. Next slide. And also just the last bullet point on that previous slide was that around the next round, which is round 6, will be conducted in November. Hence, we'll have evidence from that before the year ends as well. So basically, we have information on income and shocks, and then crops, livestock situation, as well as the food security indicators. Under income and shocks, most importantly, is that about 58% of the households reported a decrease in the main household income in the last 3 months, and this was compared to the same period in a typical year. And about 50% as well were impacted by a shock in the previous 3 months, and the main shocks were sickness or accident or death of a household member, followed by other intra-household shocks and then drought and heat. Next slide, please. On crops, the majority of farmers reported that they had planted the same areas in the typical year. That's about 41%. But 29% stated they had planted slightly less, and only 1% had planted slightly more. That's for the previous season. The majority of households also harvested slightly less than in a typical year, whereas 29% stated that they harvested a lot less, which is more than 50% less than their typical or their normal year. And about 83% of crop producers faced difficulties in crop production, and the major difficulty has to do with not enough water, be it irrigation or rain, and followed by lack of access to fertilizers, which is a pertinent issue we've been discussing since the beginning of this meeting. And that affected about 31% of the households that were responding. Major crop sales difficulties highlighted low selling prices for about 46% of the producers, and the fact that not many people were buying for about 33%. Next slide, please. This is because of time, but I think the presentation will be shared. So some of the points that I'm skipping through, you can go through them. And of course, we will share the website so you can get more in-depth information. As you can see, I'm presenting this at the national level, but then the information is granulated and lowers down to the provincial level, which you can access on our website through the maps that are interactive. For the livestock situation, livestock production was affected mainly by diseases and death for about 69% of the households. And the main driver for livestock numbers changes also alluded to poor health, malnutrition, or injury for about 35%. And with regards to sales difficulties, the same goes for livestock. That was the situation with the crop production, that not many customers are buying as usual, and their payment delays as well, and low selling prices. I'll move on to the next slide, which is the food security. Oh, this map was just to show you the predominant agricultural production shocks and the just highlighting the provinces that the predominant shock that was highlighted in the specific provinces, like Marsh Central, for example, plant disease was their main highlighted problem, whereas the rest of the provinces highlighted animal disease affecting animals and causing death in some instances. Food security outcomes, the next slide, please, thank you. So we have various food security indicators that we monitor. Our household hunger score showed that about 37% of households ran out of food during the past 30 days. And in addition to that, from the HHS, we also saw that March North had about 47% of the respondent households who were facing little to no hunger, whilst about 18% had slight and 17% moderate and 18% severe hunger, which is indicative of IPC phase 3 crisis for that particular indicator only. According to our fears, about 6% of the households were facing severe hunger, whilst 22% were facing moderate and 16% slight, and 56% little to no hunger. According to our HDDS, which has the graph on the side, the majority of households had a high dietary diversity score, that's for about 55%, but then 36% had medium and 10% had low. And in Matabeleland North, they also had the highest proportion of households consuming low dietary diversity, followed by Matabeleland South. According to the livelihood coping strategies, the majority of households were using emergency strategies. And I think this speaks to the presentation by, must have been Imran, who alluded to strategies such as overselling of livestock. And this is what we saw in Zimbabwe as well. The next slide, please. Households were asked what their needs are for the next 3 months. And 29% of households highlighted that their main need in terms of input support was going to be fertilizers, and 29% highlighted seed, whilst about 50% of the households reported having cash and food assistance needs in the next 3 months. And this is the beginning of the mid season, hence this is expected based on the findings that have been shared in this particular meeting. That is the website, Data in Emergencies, where you can access all this information. And the next slide shows you part of some of the interactive way that the data is expressed on the website. And it can be filtered by countries. You can see the indicators that are on the slide after Sierra Leone. These can also be filtered. So when you get into the website, you can then indicate Zimbabwe, and you can get specific information on Zimbabwe. And then the maps will show you which areas, and like I say, it's representative at provincial level, but very pertinent for decision making. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Angela, for that presentation, quite rich with information. And I guess we can all relate that this is the kind of evidence that we need, especially on the food security side. Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm just going to open up for questions for the two presentations, the ones from Jones and the ones from Angela. Anything online yet? All right. Okay, Sipo, you can ask your question.
I just wanted to ask Angela, in terms of the DM surveys, if there was any information given on access to vaccines, as we've seen that the Russia-Ukraine crisis has had quite an impact on availability of fertilizers, because some of the main ingredients for fertilizers are being imported from Russia and Ukraine. I just wanted to know if there was any information in terms of access to vaccines and how possibly that is also influencing the import of vaccine ingredients for livestock diseases.
As part of this monitoring survey, there's no question specifically on vaccines that we're asking also. But if there are specific areas, specific countries that you would like that question to be included in, please.
Thanks a lot, Angela. We still don't have anything from the colleagues online. And I think that we've just verified there is nothing so far. So I'm just going to move on to the next items. And essentially, under partners update, we're trying to introduce a situation where partners can also provide updates for this round of, for the October meeting. We didn't get that, and we are hoping that we'll get something in November, but we want to increase our partner participation. So certainly moving ahead, we are going to be doing that. Then we have one item under, I'll call it A or B. Yes, the FNSWG retreat. We had planned to have a retreat in November, but we noticed there is a clash that is terribly affecting our planning in November. So we are going to move that to January. We really are prioritizing these activities. We want to make sure that we update our work plan and make sure that we remain relevant. We continue to, discuss issues that are relevant to our partners. So definitely the retreat is coming in January, and we'll share the actual dates sometime in November. So just to advise you that it's no longer in November, but it's now in January. And thank you very much for those who have provided some inputs on what they would want prioritized for the different thematic areas that were shared by Selam. And for those who haven't done so, can we continue to do that so that by the time we come to the planning retreat, we have everything that we need for that. At this point in time, colleagues, allow me to close the meeting. My apologies for the 2 minutes that I've stolen from you. It could have been worse, but we've tried our best to minimize the damage. So colleagues, thank you very much for your patience with us. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again in November for the November meeting. For those of us who are attending RIASCO, we'll meet again on Thursday. Otherwise, colleagues, thank you and enjoy the rest of the week.
Thanks, Godfrey. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Okay.
Obrigado.
Thank you. Yeah, we are done.
Yes. No.